Hello, I'm Corey Hello, and welcome to another episode of Critimation, where I review animated TV shows and films. As always, I do not own any of these films or shows. They are properties of their respected owners. For today's guest star, please welcome SaidHi from Twitch.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ash said hi. I broadcast on Twitch and I play mostly retro games and Nintendo games. I've been broadcasting since March of 2019. So I've been a content creator since then. And I'm also a host and one of the leaders of a Twitch guild. So I'm very active in the online community, in streaming and content creation.
Our first topic will be the 1941 Disney movie, Dumbo. What's interesting about this movie is that, unlike the previous films like Fantasia and Snow White, this one had more of a budget due to the effects of the war in Europe. In fact, this film was originally going to be shown on the cover of Times magazine, but due to Pearl Harbor, it got bumped. But if you notice, the backgrounds and character models are more limited in terms of detail. This is again due to the previous films being a failure and thereby putting Dumbo on a smaller budget. The film opens with the parody of the postman's slogan, but then goes into the opening song about Mr. Stoke delivering babies. And if you listen closely to the lyrics, it's obviously poking fun at the then recent baby boom of that decade. So these Stokes drop off a bunch of baby animals at a circus, but it appears that one of the elephants, Mrs. Jumbo, is expecting, but her bundle is a late arrival. She eventually gets it when one of the Stokes delivers it to her while the train is heading to its next location. This is when we get introduced to the title character, who is a baby elephant with unusually large ears, and is therefore made fun of by the other elephants. After the train, named Casey Jr., stops at its location, we then get to one of the key topics I want to talk about, which I don't think a lot of people in reviews of this film even discuss. And that's the Rouseabout song. The opening lyric was, "We work all day, we work all night, we never learn to read or write." And it's being sung by these dark skinned people who don't have any faces. The rest of the song is basically them saying we work ourselves to death, and when we do get paid, we just throw it away. What does that say to you?
Well, I think the thing that's difficult to pinpoint is whether or not the people are dark-skinned at all. I do think that the movie is implying that the people are dark-skinned, but it's hard to say for certain because the scene is happening at night. And
Yeah.
I mean, I think that by the text of what you just read to me, the sad thing is that because of inherent bias, people might automatically assume that they are meaning dark-skinned people, but I don't necessarily think that it should be assumed that that is the case. I do also think that because of the time, people could say that, but there were many, many, many different people of color who were, in servitude or some form of slavery or some form of oppression in that kind of way where they were, only the manual labor. So it is a nuanced topic. It's very tricky, but I do think that the song itself could be looked at a way to reflect on what was the world in that time and be ask us to question, was this something that was considered a normal thing? Why was this something that was considered a part of what was going on in the world? So is it inherently offensive? I don't think the song is offensive in the time when you consider the context of the time. I think if somebody was to replicate this scene and implant it in a movie today, I think it would really depend on the context. But, if we're just looking on the surface of this is what we expect say like this is what we expect of the people, like, people of color, black people of that time, and say like this is what their life is and what it is defined to be, then yes, that would be offensive. But if we take it as the context and, kind of understand what was going on today and try to understand why these things happened in the past, we should take those notes and learn from it and understand why these stories could be thought to be fueled by stereotypes of the time.
After the tents are set up, some kids coming in to see the sideshow poke fun at Dumbo's ears, causing Mrs. Jumbo to try to defend him through violence. This results in her being locked up in a cage, leaving Dumbo all alone. During this time, he is befriended by a mouse named Timothy, who promises to help him find a way to free his mother. After tricking the ringmaster in his sleep, Timothy is able to get Dumbo a role in a performance done by the other elephants. It doesn't go well, and as a result, they make him a clown. After his first performance as such, Timothy cheers him up by having him be able to visit his mother. They then stop for a drink, unaware that it's been contaminated with alcohol tipped over by one of the clowns. This causes the two to get drunk and start seeing pink elephants leading up to the more tippy part of the film. By the time they wake up, they are in a tree and they meet a group of crows, which brings us to the film's elephant in the room. Pardon the expression. The crows themselves were often coded as being stereotypes for black people. Would you agree with that, Ash?
Yeah, I think that that definitely that could be considered true. Absolutely.
Furthermore, the leader of the crows, who unlike the other members of his group, is voiced by a white person. And while not stated in the movie, the production art gives him the name Jim Crow, which is a reference to the segregation laws that were in place at the time.
So, I mean, if he gave him the name afterwards, right, and that was what was written behind closed doors, it is definitely a reference to the Jim Crow laws. Is it racist? It could be, yes, especially with the way that the crow speaks, his accent, the way that he uses words, the vernacular, like it feels like the character was meant to be portrayed as black. So then for that reason, I would have to agree that it is a crude representation and again speaks to the time of when the movie was written and animated.
Once they get out of the tree, Timothy realizes that Dumbo must have unconsciously flew up into the tree. The crows, however, poke fun at the idea, and Timothy scolds them, telling them that Dumbo's been through a lot and they should be ashamed of themselves for making fun of him. The crows then sympathize with this, and they decide to help Dumbo learn to fly. Now, this particular scene has been used as a way to defend the crows, stating that it's an allegory for how, in that time period, the black community was considered inferior and often treated badly, much like Dumbo was.
Yeah, I guess you kind of have to take all of it into context, right? Like, who is writing the story? What did Disney stand for at the time? Are they doing anything to advocate for Black people other than showing what, typical tropes of Black people were? Like, what's the whole story? And then I think if you think about that holistically, it would kind of give you a better sense to understand, like, is this character being used to propagate a stereotype or is it being used to call attention to a greater problem? And I wonder if people at the time would have put two and two together to say, hey, this is a problem. Maybe we need to stop treating people this way. Maybe we need to stop treating Black people this way. But I don't know if that was the conclusion that someone would draw from seeing those scenes.
Through the combination of a magic feather and Dumbo's oversized ears, he is able to fly. But when he goes to do it back at the circus, he loses grip of the feather, but thanks to Timothy, he is able to realize that he can fly without it. After which Dumbo becomes a big star and his mother is freed, allowing them to be together again, thus ending the film on a happy note. And while I would recommend this film, please note that there is some material that hasn't aged well, such as The Crows. But besides that, it's easy to see why Disney made a live action remake to this movie, which is not as good as the original. Our second and last topic will be the Disney movie The Princess and the Frog, which is basically a updated version of the Frog Prince fairy tale. The film's prologue opens in New Orleans, where the main character, Tiana, and her mother, who works as a seamstress for the father of Tiana's friend, Charlotte, are heading home to where the father is preparing dinner. Tiana says that she wants to open a restaurant so she can share the family's recipes with the town, and her father reminds her that she has to make an effort. It's not just enough to wish for it. Now, the film takes place in the 1920s in New Orleans, but it feels kind of idealistic in terms of story. Would you agree?
I mean, in general, I would say that Disney is in general idealizing any story that they've written. I think that that is really something that is a part of the Disney culture when it comes to writing stories. So I don't necessarily think that this is an issue specific to Princess and the Frog. I think this is how Disney treats a lot of the worlds that they build.
That does make sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that yes, when Tiana and her mom, I believe, are riding the train to go back to their house, you go from looking at the big estate manors, the big mansions, to the small huts that the Black people live in. Does it feel reflective of the time? Yes. Does it idealize it? Absolutely, because they want people to feel good when they're watching the movies. Does that scrub clean some of the difficulties that people were living in at that time, or maybe were experiencing, just the disparity between how people were living and being in servitude? Absolutely. But again, this is a movie made by Disney, and that's par for the core, That's par for the course.
When Tiana grows up, she takes on a few waitress jobs in order to raise money to buy a space for her restaurant. Eventually, Charlotte commissions her to be a caterer at her father's banquet, allowing her to get enough money to buy the property. Meanwhile, the banquet's guest of honor, Prince Naveen, arrives in New Orleans with plans to marry Charlotte so that he can be able to keep his fortune going, as his parents had cut him off. Now, a lot of audience members don't really consider Naveen to be actually African American because Naveen's actually an Indian based name and he has a French accent and is from a country that's completely made up. This kind of makes his identity a bit ambiguous.
I mean, I definitely think the way that he was animated and drawn, yes, definitely seems ambiguous, and your point on the name does make sense. It doesn't mean that he can't be mixed, though.
On the way to Charlotte's place, Naveen and his butler Lawrence come across the resident voodoo doctor known as Dr. Falerier, better known as the Shadow Man. And he basically tricks Naveen into making a deal with him, which ends up turning him into a frog and having Lawrence take his place. Now, I remember hearing this from someone I knew in college. Voodoo is not a form of magic, it's actually a religion, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
So then the Shadow Man and Mama Odie are actually stereotypes. Huh.
Well, I don't know that either. I mean, there's different forms of voodoo or voodoo that I am not privy to, I'm not educated on to be able to speak
Oh,
on the real
okay.
world aspects of voodoo and voodoo. I mean, but could the way that Disney portrayed them be considered stereotypical? I think in order to kind of like water down the understanding of what it is to tell the story in their typical Disney fashion in a movie, yes, I'm sure that they stripped it of the real world understanding and, used like tropes to tell a story. But this is again something very typical to the way that Disney handles certain culture, especially before, a certain time period where maybe they were a little bit more conscious of the decisions that they made. So I think it's possible, but I don't know if it inherently exactly what you said. I do think that it is possible.
All right, I just know that the only other time I've really seen someone kind of like the Shadow Man was in that one James Bond movie, which had a similar figure.
Yeah, it's a tough subject, definitely misunderstood by people outside of anyone who studies voodoo or voodoo. So yeah, I would definitely encourage people to read up and learn more about it if they can, so that they can make that kind of judgment for themselves and really understand, like, is it a harmful depiction? I'm going to generally stay on the side of like, if they're watering it down to tell a story in a movie, there's probably some harm in the depiction because they're not fully using all the aspects of what would make this, something to celebrate versus like, yeah, this is evil, dark, magic, bad guy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's typical Disney behavior.
So while Lois, disguised as Naveen, is dancing with Charlotte, the owners of the property that Tiana's trying to buy for a restaurant let her know that she has been outbidded and that a person of her background would otherwise have trouble running a restaurant anyway. Would that be borderline racist in context or not?
I mean, I think it goes more than racism. I think it's also probably because she's a woman as well.
That's what I thought at first before I started looking into the scene.
I mean, it could be both. There's no reason why it couldn't be both.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you, if it was a man running it, I feel like it probably would have been seen as a more business transaction because I feel like it's definitely common for people to question whether or not a woman could run a business. So I think it's a little of both.
During this confrontation, Tiana ruins her dress, so Charlotte gets her all cleaned up with a new outfit. During which Naveen, now as a frog, tries to convince her to kiss him so he'd change back. But in doing so, Tiana becomes a frog herself. Shortly after, the two end up in the bayou where they meet an alligator named Lewis who loves to play the trumpet, and a Cajun firefly named Ray who tell them about Mama Odie, a woman who can supposedly change them back. During their travel down the bayou, Naveen learns about the importance of hard work while Tiana gets to learn about having fun, as she never really had much of a social life, and the two start to fall in love. I've seen some videos that Tiana being a strong workaholic, would that be a problem with black people, especially with black women?
I personally don't think so. The other princesses are your more typical, like, live in a castle, like, ruling an area, don't have to be in some kind of servitude except for like Cinderella, you know what I mean? I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to be a dedicated hard worker, but are the other Princess and the Frog stories like, is the princess not a workaholic? Did they specifically change Tiana to be a workaholic versus the other Princess and the Frog stories? I don't know. I think if they did do that, then it could be. But if they
Uh,
didn't do that, and this is typical to her story, then I don't know.
I just know that the original fairy tale did have her as a princess per se, and they changed that in the film.
Uh,
Once the group find Mama Odie, she tells them the only way to break the spell is to have Naveen kiss a princess. And since Charlotte is supposed to be the princess of Mardi Gras, it technically counts. Shortly after arriving back in New Orleans, Naveen is captured by shadow creatures sent by the Shadow Man, so they can use Naveen's blood in order to keep Lois's disguise going. Thankfully, Ray finds out and frees Naveen while also stealing the amulet used for Lois's disguise, but gets seriously injured in the process. Tiana gets a hold of it and the shaman offers to make her restaurant a reality in exchange for it. But refusing to dishonor her father's wishes, Tiana destroys the amulet, resulting in the Shadow Man being sucked down to his death by the Shadow Demons. When Naveen and Tiana are reunited, they confess their love for each other and decide to remain frogs. After giving the now dead Ray a funeral in which he is reincarnated into an evening star, the two are married, and since that makes Tiana now a princess, the two are returned to their human form. The film ends with Tiana finally being able to open her restaurant and living happily ever after. While I do applaud Disney for trying to revive hand-drawn animation, which has a special quality to it in contrast to CGI, plus the fact that it was becoming popular in foreign countries like Ireland, it should be noted that while this film that is basically a Disney princess movie for those who do not like Disney princess films is indeed Disney's best movie since the 90s, it still has its issues. Most notably, the complaints of Tiana becoming a frog for most of the film, despite the cover showing her as a human, seems to take away from her true identity as a person.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I think out of all of the princesses, like in the Disney universe, she definitely is not herself for her movie, which none of the other princesses really ever had to face. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think that that is definitely problematic because then she's
Right.
seen as this frog rather than the princess for what she is.
And of course, this isn't the first time Disney has done something like this. There's been at least two other movies in which the minority character has been turned into an animal, namely Brother Bear and The Emperor's New Groove. It is indeed disheartening that the princess is not human for most of the movie, even though it implies that she is. And while I would recommend this movie for its animation that seems very old school for those who are looking for a nostalgic film in terms of animation style, please note there are some elements that don't make this film perfect story-wise in terms of representation. And with that, we end this episode of Critimation. Thanks for being on the show, Ash.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for reaching out. It was really nice talking to you, getting to know you, getting to hear your thoughtful questions and all of the research that you had done. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that I was able to do this with you today.
Thanks for tuning in to Critimation. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And follow me on Blue Sky. Or support me on Patreon. I'm open to suggestions, and I will see you next time.